Reminder that certainty is elusive but curiosity is endless. The lottery coincidence is a thought experiment that forces us to question how we interpret improbable events. At its heart, it challenges our ability to distinguish between random chance and deliberate manipulation. Imagine you buy a lottery ticket, and against all odds you win. The probability of this happening is so low that it feels like an extraordinary event. But now ask yourself, is it more likely that you legitimately won or that the lottery was rigged in your favor? This question might seem strange at first, but it reveals the tension between probability and our perceptions of chance. To break this down, let's start with the basics. In most lotteries, the odds of winning are astronomically low. For example, in a lottery with a 1 in a million chance of winning, there's a 0.001% probability that any single ticket is the winner. When you think about those odds, it seems almost impossible that you could win, yet someone inevitably does. Winning despite the low odds is an expected outcome. When enough people participate, the key is understanding that improbability doesn't make an event impossible. Even the rarest events become likely when given enough opportunities to occur. Now let's flip the perspective. Imagine that you win and someone accuses you of cheating. They claim the odds of you winning were so small that the only logical explanation is that the system was rigged. On the surface, this argument seems to make sense. The probability of winning is so low that it feels suspicious, but does that mean it's more likely that the lottery was manipulated? To answer this, you have to weigh two competing possibilities: the improbability of winning naturally versus the possibility of foul play. Here's where the thought experiment gets tricky. For the lottery to be rigged, someone would need the means, motive, and opportunity to manipulate the results. This introduces its own layer of complexity. If you examine the situation closely, you might realize that rigging a lottery, especially one heavily monitored by regulations, could be even less likely than winning it legitimately. The claim that the lottery was rigged needs evidence, but in its absence, the simpler explanation is that you just got lucky. This follows the principle of Abrams' razor. When faced with competing explanations, the simplest one is usually correct. But let's push this further. Humans are wired to see patterns even in randomness. This tendency, known as apophenia, makes us look for reasons behind events, especially improbable ones. When something unlikely happens, like winning a lottery, we instinctively search for meaning. We might think, why me? Was this fate? Or is there something I don't know? These questions arise because our brains struggle to accept randomness. We want events to have causes, and we're uncomfortable with the idea that some things just happen by chance. This discomfort becomes even more pronounced when the improbable event feels personal. If you win the lottery, it's not just a statistical anomaly, it's a life-changing moment. It's hard to see it as purely random because it directly affects you. This emotional reaction can make you question whether something deeper is at play. The lottery coincidence thought experiment highlights this bias, showing how our perceptions of probability are influenced by personal impact. Now let's complicate the scenario further. Imagine you didn't just win the lottery, you won twice. The odds of this happening are astronomically low, yet it has occurred in real life. For instance, a woman in the United States won 2 major lottery jackpots within a few years. People were understandably skeptical. Statisticians pointed out that while the odds of winning twice are incredibly small, they are not zero given the millions of people who play the lottery. It's not impossible for such a rare event to occur somewhere. However, because the event is so unusual, it's easy to jump to conclusions about fraud or manipulation. This reaction reveals how we struggle to comprehend extreme improbability. The lottery coincidence also has broader implications for how we interpret events beyond lotteries. For example, think about coincidences in everyday life. You might run into an old friend in a city neither of you lives in, or you might dream about something that later happens. These events feel meaningful because they are unlikely, but are they truly significant? Or are they just random occurrences that stand out because we notice them? The same logic applies to the lottery. Winning feels extraordinary, but it's only one possible outcome in a universe of possibilities. Another layer to this paradox is how we view systems of fairness. Lotteries are designed to be random, but their structure makes some outcomes inevitable. Someone has to win even if the odds are low. This creates a tension between our expectations of fairness and the reality of chance. If a lottery winner is accused of cheating simply because their win was improbable, it undermines the entire premise of randomness. The thought experiment forces us to confront our biases about what we consider fair or suspicious. The lottery coincidence also raises questions about how we evaluate evidence. When we say something is unlikely, we're making a judgment based on probabilities, but probabilities are only part of the equation. Context matters too. If you know a lottery has strict safeguards, the odds of fraud might be lower than the odds of someone winning naturally. This context shapes how we interpret improbable events. It reminds us that probability alone doesn't determine what's true. We must also consider the circumstances. Ultimately, the lottery coincidence highlights the limits of human intuition when it comes to chance. We're not naturally good at understanding probability, and our emotions often cloud our judgment. The thought experiment challenges us to think critically about how we interpret unlikely events. It forces us to ask whether our suspicions are based on evidence or simply on our discomfort with randomness. The paradox doesn't have a definitive answer, which is what makes it so fascinating. It's not about proving whether the lottery was rigged or legitimate. It's about exploring how we think. It reveals the assumptions and biases that shape our understanding of the world. In doing so, it encourages us to question our perceptions and to approach improbability with both curiosity and skepticism. The lottery coincidence reminds us that life is full of rare events. Sometimes they're just luck, other times they may point to deeper patterns. The challenge is learning to tell the difference without letting our instincts lead us astray. Whether it's a lottery win, a chance encounter, or a strange coincidence, the improbable is a part of life. Understanding it helps us make sense of the world even when the odds seem impossible. The sorcerer's apprentice syndrome is a concept that captures what happens when power, once unleashed, spirals out of control. The term comes from a famous story most notably depicted in Disney's Fantasia, where an apprentice enchants a broom to perform his chores. The broom follows the apprentice's command to fetch water, but when the task is done, it doesn't stop. It continues fetching water, flooding the room. The apprentice, lacking the skill to undo the spell, watches helplessly as the chaos grows worse. This tale has become a metaphor for situations where human actions or creations, especially those involving technology or systems, take on a life of their own. The idea resonates deeply because it illustrates a key human vulnerability: the gap between power and control. People often develop tools or systems to solve problems, but they don't always consider the long-term consequences. Once set in motion, these systems can act in unexpected ways, creating new problems that spiral out of control. This isn't just a fable, it's a recurring theme in history, technology, and even nature. Take the Industrial Revolution as an example. The invention of machinery and factories transformed societies, making production faster and cheaper. But this rapid progress came with unforeseen consequences. Pollution from factories poisoned rivers, and air. Child labor became a widespread problem. The very tools designed to make life easier created a host of new challenges. The same pattern can be seen in modern technologies. The rise of artificial intelligence offers incredible potential, but it also raises ethical concerns. What happens when AI systems make decisions that humans can't understand or control? This echoes the apprentice's dilemma. Once you set the broom, or in this case the algorithm, into motion, how do you stop it when it goes too far? This syndrome also appears in the natural world. Consider the introduction of non-native species to ecosystems in Australia. Rabbits were brought in during the 19th century for hunting without natural predators. Their population exploded, causing widespread ecological damage. What seemed like a simple solution to a minor problem became an environmental crisis. The same principle applies to many human-made interventions in nature. Efforts to control pests with chemicals, for instance, have often backfired. Pesticides kill not only pests but also beneficial insects like bees, disrupting entire ecosystems. Over time, pests can develop resistance, making the problem even harder to solve. The sorcerer's apprentice syndrome also plays out in financial systems. During the 2008 global financial crisis, complex financial products like mortgage-backed securities were created to maximize profits. These tools became so complicated that even the experts using them didn't fully understand their risks. When the housing market collapsed, these financial instruments amplified the damage, causing a cascade of economic failures. The systems designed to grow wealth ended up threatening the entire global economy. The digital age has introduced new forms of this syndrome. Social media platforms, for example, were designed to connect people and share information. While they've succeeded in that goal, they've also created problems like misinformation, echo chambers, and mental health issues. Algorithms optimized to keep users engaged often prioritize sensational or polarizing content, unintentionally contributing to social divisions. The platforms can't simply turn off these effects without undermining their business models. Once again, the apprentice finds themselves unable to stop the enchanted broom. One of the most concerning modern examples is climate change. Human innovation, particularly during the industrial era, unlocked the ability to harness fossil fuels for energy. This allowed societies to grow at an unprecedented rate, improving living standards worldwide. However, burning these fuels has released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, trapping heat and disrupting the planet's climate systems. Rising temperatures, melting ice caps, and extreme weather events are just the beginning of a complex chain reaction. Even though we now understand The risks the systems built around fossil fuels are so deeply entrenched that reversing the damage feels like an impossible task. The more we try to fix the problem, the more unintended consequences we uncover. A key element of the sorcerer-apprentice syndrome is the lack of foresight. The apprentice casts a spell without understanding its full implications, much like humanity often acts without fully considering the long-term effects of its innovations. This isn't always due to ignorance or carelessness. Sometimes the agency to solve a problem overshadows the need to plan for potential consequences. Other times, people simply can't predict how a system will behave once it grows beyond their control. Another factor is the reliance on quick fixes. The apprentice doesn't want to carry water manually, so he takes a shortcut with magic. Similarly, humans often seek immediate solutions without addressing root causes. This is especially true in areas like healthcare, where antibiotics have revolutionized medicine while they've saved countless lives. Overuse has led to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, a serious global health threat. What began as a miracle solution is now creating new challenges that are harder to solve. The syndrome also reveals the importance of humility in the face of complexity. The apprentice assumes he can handle the broom just as humans assume they can manage their creations, but complexity often outpaces understanding. In systems like global supply chains, environmental policies, or financial markets, small changes can have unpredictable ripple effects. This concept, known as the butterfly effect, shows how interconnected systems amplify seemingly minor actions. Recognizing these dynamics requires a shift in mindset. Instead of assuming mastery, people must approach complex systems with caution and respect. So how can the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome be avoided? The first step is to recognize its patterns. By studying past examples, humanity can learn to anticipate unintended consequences. The second step is to build safeguards into systems from the start. This might mean creating fail-safes, conducting rigorous testing, or planning for worst-case scenarios. The third step is adaptability. When problems arise, systems need to be flexible enough to adjust without collapsing. The final step is responsibility. Just as the sorcerer returns to fix the apprentice's mistake, those who create systems must take accountability for their impacts. While the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome highlights risks, it also underscores human creativity and resilience. The same ingenuity that creates problems can also solve them, whether it's finding ways to mitigate climate change, designing ethical AI, or building more sustainable societies. The potential for positive change is immense. The challenge lies in balancing ambition with caution, ensuring that the brooms we set into motion serve us rather than overwhelm us. The infinite regress of reasons is a concept that challenges how we justify what we believe or know. At its core, it asks a simple but unsettling question: how do we explain why something is true without needing an endless chain of reasons for every claim or belief we hold? We typically justify it by referring to something else, but what happens when we ask for the justification of that reason, and then the one after that? This cycle could in theory go on forever. That's where the problem lies. It's not just a philosophical puzzle, it has real implications for how we think about truth, knowledge, and reasoning. To understand the infinite regress of reasons, imagine a child repeating reply asking why. You might start with a simple statement such as "the sky is blue." The child asks, "Why is the sky blue?" You answer, "Because sunlight scatters through the atmosphere." Then comes another "Why? Why does sunlight scatter?" And you reply, "Because of how light interacts with molecules in the air." But the questions don't stop there. Each answer leads to another "why," and eventually you might find yourself unable to explain further. You either say, "I don't know," or you settle on something like, "That's just the way it is." This simple example illustrates the problem of infinite regress. For every reason we provide a further reason can always be demanded. If we insist on having a reason for everything, we risk falling into an endless loop. The infinite regress of reasons challenges us to think about where, if anywhere, this chain of justification should stop. Philosophers have explored this issue for centuries. The problem can be summarized as follows: when we justify a belief, we rely on another belief. That second belief then needs justification, which depends on a third belief, and so on. If we insist on providing a justification for every belief in the chain, we face an infinite regress. But infinite chains of reasoning are impractical, and some argue impossible. So how do we resolve this? One approach is foundationalism. Foundationalists argue that the chain of reasons doesn't need to go on forever because it can stop at certain basic beliefs. These basic beliefs don't require further justification. They are considered self-evident or obvious. For example, foundationalists might point to sensory experiences like seeing a tree or feeling pain as beliefs that don't need external reasons. You see the tree, And that's enough to believe it exists. Foundationalism provides a way to stop the regress by grounding reasoning in something that doesn't require further explanation. Another approach is coherentism. Coherentists reject the idea of foundational beliefs. Instead, they argue that beliefs are justified by how well they fit into a broader web of interconnected beliefs. Think of a spider web. No single strand holds the entire web together, but the web as a whole is stable. In coherentism, no belief stands alone, but the network of beliefs supports each one. The regressive reason stops not because we find a foundational belief, but because the system as a whole provides justification. A third approach is infinitism, which embraces the infinite regress. Infinitists argue that the chain of reasons doesn't need to stop. Instead, they claim that an infinite series of reasons can provide justification as long as each step in the chain adds something new. While this idea may seem counterintuitive, infinitists believe that the possibility of an infinite regress isn't a problem. It's just a feature of how reasoning works. Each of these approaches has its strengths and weaknesses. Foundationalism offers clarity but raises questions about what counts as a basic belief. Coherentism avoids the need for foundational beliefs but risks becoming circular as beliefs justify each other within the same system. Infinitism sidesteps the need for a stopping point but faces challenges in explaining how infinite chains of reasoning work. In practice, the infinite regressive reasons doesn't just apply to abstract philosophy, it's real to everyday life. Consider how we justify moral beliefs. If you believe that helping others is good, you might justify it by saying it creates happiness. But why is happiness good? If you answer because it improves well-being, someone could still ask, why is well-being valuable? The chain of reasoning can continue indefinitely, forcing you to either settle on a foundational belief, argue that your beliefs form a coherent system, or accept the possibility of infinite justification. Science also grapples with this problem. Scientific explanations rely on observations, theories, and evidence, but they are not immune to the regressive reasons. A scientist might explain a phenomenon using a particular theory, but that theory itself relies on prior assumptions and evidence. Dig deep enough, and you'll reach questions about the nature of reality or the limits of human knowledge. At some point, even science encounters the challenge of justifying its most basic principles. The infinite regressive reasons also plays a role in debates about skepticism. Skeptics often use the regress problem to question whether we can truly know anything at all. If every belief requires justification and justification leads to an endless chain, how can we claim to know anything with certainty? Skepticism forces us to confront the limits of our reasoning and consider whether some things must simply be accepted without further explanation. Despite its complexity, the infinite regress of reasons invites us to think critically about how we justify our beliefs. It reminds us that our understanding of the world isn't as straightforward as it seems. Whether we embrace foundational beliefs, coherent systems, or infinite chains of reasoning, the regress problem challenges us to examine the foundations of our thinking. Ultimately, the infinite regress of reasons is a paradox without a simple solution. It's not something to be solved in the traditional sense, but rather a lens through which to explore how we think and justify what we believe. By confronting the infinite regress, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of reasoning and the limits of human knowledge. It's a reminder that some questions may not have final answers, and that's part of what makes them worth asking. The youth Afro dilemma is one of the most well-known philosophical puzzles, named after a dialogue by Plato. In this conversation, Socrates asks a seemingly simple question: is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? At first glance, it seems like a straightforward query, but it reveals deep and challenging questions about morality, divinity, and the nature of goodness. To understand the dilemma, it helps to break it down. The first option is that something is good because the gods command it. This means that moral values are determined solely by divine will. Whatever the gods decide is good becomes good, and whatever they reject is bad. On the surface, this makes morality clear and objective. If the gods set the rules, then all one has to do is follow them. However, this raises a troubling issue. If goodness is simply what the gods command, then it seems arbitrary. If the gods decided that lying or stealing were good, then those acts would become morally right even though they seem wrong to us. This would make morality dependent on divine one with no deeper reason behind it. The second option is that the gods command something because it is good. In this case, morality exists independently of the gods. The gods recognize what is good and choose to endorse it. This seems more intuitive because it suggests that moral values are rooted in something stable and universal, not just in the will of the gods. However, this raises another problem. If goodness exists independently of the gods, then the gods are not the ultimate source of morality. They are simply messengers or enforcers of a higher moral truth. This seems to diminish the power and authority of the gods, as they are no longer the creators of right and wrong, but are subject to an external standard. The dilemma leaves us in a bind. If morality comes solely from divine command, it feels arbitrary and potentially unjust. If morality exists independently of divine command, then the gods are not truly sovereign over morality. Either way, the relationship between morality and divinity becomes deeply complicated. To see how this dilemma plays out in practice, consider its implications for different belief systems in monotheistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. God is often viewed as the ultimate source of morality. The youth dilemma challenges this view by asking whether God's commands create morality or reflect it. If morality depends entirely on God's commands, then it seems arbitrary. For example, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," is good only because God said so, but if God had commanded something different, such as "Thou shalt kill," would that also be good? This makes moral laws seem less like timeless truths and more like rules that could change on a whim. On the other hand, if God commands something because it is already good, then morality does not originate with God, it exists independently, which undermines the idea that God is the ultimate foundation of morality. Philosophers and theologians have wrestled with this dilemma for centuries. One response is to argue that morality is grounded in God's nature rather than in God's commands. In this view, God does not decide what is good arbitrarily. Instead, goodness is an essential part of who God is. For example, if God is inherently loving and just, then God's commands reflect those qualities. Lying and stealing are wrong not because God randomly decided they were wrong, but because they contradict God's loving and just nature. This response avoids the problem of arbitrariness while maintaining that morality ultimately depends on God. However, it still raises questions. If goodness is part of God's nature, then is God's nature itself subject to some higher standard of goodness? If so, we are back to the idea of morality existing independently of God. The youth dilemma also has implications beyond religion. Even in secular contexts, it raises important questions about the nature of morality. If moral values do not come from a divine source, then where do they come from? Are they universal truths that exist independently of human opinion, or are they social constructs created by cultures and societies? For example, many people agree that acts like murder and theft are wrong, but are they wrong because of some objective moral standard or because humans have collectively decided they are harmful and undesirable? The dilemma forces us to think about the origins and foundations of our moral beliefs, whether we attribute them to a divine source or not. One way to approach the dilemma is to reframe the question. Instead of asking whether morality depends on divine command or exists independently, we might ask what makes something good in the first place. For example, some philosophers argue that morality is based on the consequences of actions. In this view, an action is good if it leads to positive outcomes, such as happiness, well-being, or the reduction of suffering. This approach, known as consequentialism, does not rely on divine authority or external standards. Instead, it focuses on practical results. However, consequentialism has its own challenges. Determining what counts as a positive outcome can be subjective and different. People may disagree about what consequences are most important. Other philosophers argue that morality is based on duties or principles rather than outcomes. This view, known as deontology, suggests that certain actions are right or wrong regardless of their consequences. For example, lying might always be wrong because it violates a fundamental principle of honesty. Deontology avoids the subjectivity of consequentialism but can lead to rigid rules that seem impractical or overly strict. For instance, if lying is always wrong, does that mean it is wrong to lie to protect someone's life? These debates show that even outside the context of divine command, the nature of morality remains complex and contested. The AFO dilemma ultimately challenges us to think deeply about the relationship between morality, authority, and reason. It asks us to consider whether moral truths are created or discovered, whether they are fixed or flexible, and whether they depend on divine will or human understanding. While the dilemma does not provide easy answers, it serves as a powerful tool for exploring these questions. By grappling with it, we gain a better understanding of the complexities of morality and the challenges of defining what it means to be good. Whether we look to religion, philosophy, or practical reasoning for guidance, the UFO dilemma reminds us that morality is not a simple matter but a profound and ongoing journey of discovery. The paradox of omniscience is a fascinating and challenging concept to explore. At its core, the paradox questions whether it is logically possible for a being to know everything, including its own future actions. If an omniscient being truly knows everything, this would include all events in the universe, every decision made by every creature, and even every thought or action the being itself will take. However, this idea raises difficult questions. Can such a being act freely if it already knows everything it will do? Does its foreknowledge limit its power or freedom to choose? These questions lie at the heart of the Paradox. To understand this paradox, let's consider what omniscience means. An omniscient being by definition knows everything there is to know, past, present, and future. This includes not just facts about the external world, but also knowledge of its own thoughts, plans, and decisions. For example, if such a being decides to lift a stone tomorrow, it would already know that decision today. But if the being already knows this, is it truly free to decide otherwise? If it can change its mind, then its previous knowledge of lifting the stone would have been incorrect, which contradicts the idea of omniscience. On the other hand, if the being cannot change its mind, then it seems limited by its own foreknowledge, raising the question of whether it is truly all-powerful or free. To illustrate this further, imagine a scenario involving a hypothetical omniscient being. Supposed as being writes a detailed book describing every event in the universe, including every action it will take. The book is perfectly accurate. It cannot be wrong, as this would contradict the being's omniscience. However, once the book is written, could the being choose to act differently from what the book predicts? If it does, the book would be incorrect. If it cannot, then it seems trapped by its own knowledge. This is where the paradox becomes evident. Omniscience appears to conflict with free will. Some philosophers argue that the paradox arises from a misunderstanding of what it means to know the future. They suggest that foreknowledge does not necessarily mean determinism. For instance, just because a being knows what will happen does not mean it caused those events, or that the events couldn't happen differently. Consider a simple analogy. If you record a football game and later watch the recording, you know how the game ends, but your knowledge doesn't affect the player's actions during the game. In this view, an omniscient being's knowledge of future events doesn't necessarily prevent those events from being freely chosen. However, this explanation doesn't fully resolve the paradox. When applied to the being itself, if the omniscient being knows in advance what it will do, can it act differently from what it knows? If it can, its previous knowledge was wrong. If it cannot, then it seems bound by its own foreknowledge, which challenges the idea of freedom. This dilemma highlights the tension between knowing everything and having the ability to act freely. Another layer of complexity arises when considering whether an omniscient being can know the unknowable. For example, can it know the outcome of truly random events like the decay of a radioactive atom? Quantum mechanics suggests that certain processes in the universe are fundamentally indeterminate, meaning their outcomes cannot be predicted with absolute certainty. If an omniscient being knows the outcomes of these processes, it raises questions about whether the universe is truly random. If the being does not know these outcomes, then it seems its knowledge is incomplete, which contradicts the definition of omniscience. The paradox also touches on the concept of self-knowledge. For an omniscient being to truly know everything, it must also know every detail about itself, its thoughts, motivations, and actions. But can a being fully comprehend itself without creating a loop of infinite reflection? Imagine standing between two mirrors, each reflecting the other endlessly. The reflections stretch on forever, creating a complex and infinite image. Similarly, an omniscient being's attempt to fully know itself might lead to an infinite loop of self-reflection. This raises the question of whether complete self-knowledge is even possible, even for an omniscient being. Some theologians and philosophers attempt to resolve the paradox by redefining omniscience. They argue that omniscience does not necessarily include knowledge of future free actions. In this view, the future is not yet fixed, and even an omniscient being cannot know what hasn't been decided. Instead, the being knows all possible outcomes and is aware of every choice that could be made, but it doesn't know which choice will occur until it happens. This idea preserves free will while maintaining a broad definition of knowledge, though it limits omniscience in a specific way. Others argue that the paradox only exists because human logic is limited. From this perspective, the idea of omniscience is a concept beyond human understanding, and any attempts to analyze it using logic will inevitably fall short. This view suggests that the paradox isn't a true contradiction, but rather a reflection of the limitations of human reasoning. While this explanation avoids the problem, it leaves the paradox unresolved, offering no definitive answers. The paradox of omniscience also invites deeper questions about the nature of time and reality. If time is not linear but instead a block where past, present, and future coexist, then an omniscient being's knowledge of the future may not conflict with free will. In this view, the future already exists, and the being's knowledge is simply an observation of events that are fixed in the fabric of time. However, this idea challenges our everyday understanding of time as something that flows, creating further philosophical puzzles. Ultimately, the paradox of omniscience reveals the complexity of reconciling infinite knowledge with freedom and action. It challenges our assumptions about logic, causality, and The nature of reality. While there may never be a definitive resolution, exploring the paradox deepens our understanding of the limits of knowledge and the mysteries of existence. Whether viewed through the lens of philosophy, theology, or science, the paradox continues to provoke thought and spark debate, reminding us of the intricate interplay between what we know and what we cannot comprehend. Quantum suicide is a thought experiment that combines the principles of quantum mechanics with the nature of reality and observation. It is a deeply unsettling concept that pushes the boundaries of how we think about life, death, and the universe itself. The idea starts with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that every possible outcome of a quantum event happens in its own separate universe. In simple terms, every decision or event that could go one way or another creates a branching of realities, each one existing as its own timeline. To understand quantum suicide, it's important to grasp how this interpretation connects with the active observation. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in multiple states at once, a concept known as superposition. However, the moment an observer measures or interacts with a particle, it chooses a definite state. This interaction between observation and reality is central to understanding how quantum mechanics works. The quantum suicide thought experiment takes this principle to a much darker place. Imagine a scenario where a person sets up an experiment similar to Shring a Cat, but instead of a cat in the box, the person performing the experiment is directly involved. The setup involves a machine that is connected to a quantum event, such as the spin of a particle. If the particle spins one way, the machine triggers a lethal event. If it spins the other way, nothing happens, and the person survives. The many worlds interpretation comes into play because every time the particle spin is measured, the universe splits into two, one where the person dies and one where they live. From an outside perspective, this experiment seems straightforward. The person either survives or doesn't, and the probabilities play out as they would in any random event. However, from the perspective of the individual inside the experiment, things become far more bizarre. In the universes where the person dies, their consciousness ceases to exist. They can only ever experience the universes in which they survive. If the experiment is repeated enough times, the many worlds interpretation suggests that the person will always find themselves in the universe where they survive. To the individual, it might seem as though they are invincible, constantly jumping to the branches of reality where they continue to live. This leads to the concept of quantum immortality. The theory implies that an individual's consciousness can only exist in realities where they are alive, while death occurs in countless other universes. The person will only experience the branches where they remain alive, no matter how unlikely survival becomes to an observer outside the experiment. The probabilities of survival diminish with each trial, and the eventual outcome is certain death. But to the person performing the experiment, their experience is one of continual survival, as though they are immune to the event deadly consequences. The implications of this thought experiment are unsettling and difficult to accept. It challenges how we think about life and death, suggesting that individual consciousness is tied to specific branches of reality. If quantum immortality were true, it would mean that from the perspective of each individual, death is never experienced. Instead, their consciousness would always shift to a reality where they continue to exist. This doesn't mean that a person is physically immortal. Countless versions of them still die in other universes. It simply means that the experience of death is avoided by jumping between realities. This idea is troubling for several reasons. First, it raises questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. If your consciousness shifts to a new branch of reality every time you face death, are you still the same person? How do these branching realities affect the continuity of who you are? Second, it suggests that death, at least from the perspective of the individual, may not be as final as we currently believe. The concept of quantum immortality challenges our understanding of mortality and forces us to consider whether our perception of life is tied to a much larger, more complex system. Quantum suicide and quantum immortality are not scientific experiments. They are theoretical ideas meant to explore the implications of quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation. No one can or should attempt to test these concepts. The thought experiment is a way of grappling with the strange and often counterintuitive nature of quantum physics. It helps illustrate the potential consequences of a theory where every possible outcome creates a new universe. The idea also highlights the limitations of human understanding. Quantum mechanics operates on principles that often defy common sense. Concepts like superposition, entanglement, and wave-particle duality challenge our everyday experiences of how the world works. Quantum suicide takes these ideas to an extreme, forcing us to confront what it means to exist in a universe governed by such rules. It blurs the line between science, philosophy, and metaphysics, creating a space where our understanding of reality feels incomplete. Critics of the thought experiment argue that it misinterprets quantum mechanics and stretches the many worlds interpretation beyond its intended scope. The concept of quantum immortality assumes that consciousness plays a special role in selecting branches of reality. This idea is not supported by scientific evidence and remains purely speculative. Additionally, the thought experiment raises ethical and philosophical concerns. It uses the concept of death in a way that feels abstract, ignoring the profound emotional and physical realities of mortality. Despite these criticisms, quantum suicide remains a fascinating and provocative idea. It forces us to think about the implications of quantum mechanics in new and unsettling ways. It also reminds us that our understanding of the universe is still evolving. The many worlds interpretation is just one way to explain quantum phenomena, and it may not be the correct one. Other interpretations, such as the Copenhagen interpretation or pilot wave theory, offer different perspectives on how reality works. In the end, quantum suicide is less about proving a point and more about asking questions. It challenges us to think about the nature of reality, the role of observation, and the limits of human understanding. While it remains a thought experiment, it serves as a reminder of the complexity and of the universe. Whether or not the many worlds interpretation is correct, the idea of quantum suicide shows how deeply quantum mechanics can shape our understanding of life, death, and everything in between. The problem of induction is one of the most important challenges in philosophy, yet it's something we rarely think about in daily life. Induction is how we make generalizations based on past experiences. It's the process of observing patterns and using them to predict the future. For example, the sun has risen every day in your life, so you assume it will rise again tomorrow. This seems logical and works well for most practical purposes. However, the problem of induction asks a deeper question. How can we be certain that the future will resemble the past? Is it rational to believe that patterns we've seen before will always continue? This issue was famously explored by the philosopher David Hume. He pointed out that our real sense on induction isn't based on reason, but on habit. When we see something happen repeatedly, like the sun rising or gravity pulling objects to the ground, we grow accustomed to expecting it, but that expectation isn't guaranteed. The sun rising every day is not proof that it will rise tomorrow. It's just what has happened so far. Hume's point is simple but unsettling. There's no logical way to prove that the future will follow the same rules as the past. Consider a simple example. You see a rooster crow every morning before sunrise. You conclude that the rooster causes the sun to rise. Of course, this is absurd. The rooster's behavior has nothing to do with the sun, but this illustrates the risk of relying on patterns without understanding the underlying cause. We assume that patterns reveal truths about the world, but sometimes they mislead us. This is why the problem of induction is so important. It forces us to question how much we can trust our assumptions. Another example is the story of the turkey. Imagine a turkey is fed every day by a farmer day after day. It observes the pattern. The farmer feeds it over time. The turkey grows confident that this will always happen, but the day before Thanksgiving, the pattern changes and the turkey is no longer fed. It's slaughtered. From the turkey's perspective, induction failed. Its past experiences did not predict its future. This example highlights how relying on patterns can lead to incorrect conclusions when circumstances change. The problem of induction isn't just theoretical, it has practical implications for how we understand science. Probability and decision-making science, for example, relies heavily on induction. When scientists observe a phenomenon repeatedly, they formulate laws and theories based on those observations, but these laws are never proven with absolute certainty. They are always based on the assumption that the future will behave like the past. Newton's laws of motion, once considered universal, were later revised by Einstein's theory of relativity. This shows that even well-established scientific principles can change as we gain new information. The same uncertainty applies to probability. When you flip a coin, you expect that the chances of heads or tails are equal. This expectation is based on past experience with coin flips, but what if the coin is biased? Without knowing all the variables, we rely on patterns, and those patterns can sometimes be deceptive. The stock market is another example. Investors often try to predict future trends based on historical data, yet markets are influenced by countless factors, many of which are unpredictable. Just because a stock performed well last year doesn't mean it will perform well this year. The problem of induction also challenges the idea of absolute knowledge. If we can't be certain that patterns will hold, how can we claim to truly know anything about the future? This question has led philosophers to consider alternatives. One approach is falsifiability, proposed by Karl Popper. Instead of trying to prove that a pattern is true, Popper argued that science should focus on disproving false claims. For example, rather than saying all swans are white, we should test the claim by searching for non-white swans. If we find even one black swan, the claim is false. This approach shifts the focus from proving patterns to challenging them, which avoids some of the pitfalls of induction. Another response to the problem of induction is pragmatism. Pragmatists argue that while induction isn't perfect, it works well enough for most purposes. The fact that it's unreliable in some cases doesn't mean we should abandon it altogether. After all, without induction, we wouldn't be able to function in the world. We rely on it every day, whether we're predicting the weather, planning our schedules, or making decisions. The problem of induction reminds us to be cautious, but doesn't mean we should stop using patterns to guide our actions. To understand the full scope of this issue, it's helpful to consider alternative ways of reasoning. Deduction, for example, is another form of logic. Deduction starts with a general principle and applies it to specific cases. For instance, if all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates must be mortal. Deduction is certain as long as the premises are true, but it has limitations. It doesn't help us discover new information. It only confirms what we already know. Induction, on the other hand, allows us to learn from experience, even if it comes with uncertainty. The tension between induction and deduction reveals the complexity of human reasoning. We rely on patterns to navigate the world, but we must also recognize their limitations. The problem of induction doesn't have a simple solution, but it forces us to think critically about how we form beliefs and make decisions. It reminds us that certainty is rare and that we should approach knowledge with humility in daily life. The problem of induction can teach us to be open-minded. Just because something has always been one way doesn't mean it will stay that way. Circumstances change and surprises happen. By questioning our assumptions, we become better prepared to adapt when the unexpected occurs. This mindset is especially valuable in a world that is constantly changing. The problem of induction isn't just a challenge for philosophers, it's a reminder for all of us to think carefully, question deeply, and remain curious. Parfit's Teleporter is a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of personal identity. It asks a simple yet unsettling question. If you use a teleporter to travel from one place to another, are you still the same person when you arrive? At first glance, it might seem obvious that you would be the same. After all, teleportation is just a form of transportation like a car or a plane, but the way the teleporter works in this thought experiment introduces a deeper problem, one that forces us to reconsider what it means to be you. Imagine you step into a teleporter. The machine scans your body, mapping every molecule and atom in exact detail. It records everything, the way your cells are arranged, your brain's connections, your memories, your personality. Then it destroys your physical body at the starting point and sends all the recorded information to a destination. At the destination, another machine uses this information to rebuild your body exactly as it was. The person who steps out of the teleporter looks, thinks, and acts just like you. They remember everything you did, know everyone you know, and feel like the same person who stepped into the teleporter. But is it really you? The problem lies in the destruction of your original body. If your physical body is annihilated and a new body is created elsewhere, is the new body still you, or is it just a perfect copy? Philosophers like Derek Parfit argue that this raises questions about what it means to be the same person over time. Is your identity tied to your physical body, or is it something more abstract like your memories and personality? If the copy at the destination is identical in every way, does it even matter if the original was destroyed? Some people argue that the person who steps out of the teleporter is you. They point out that every cell in your body is already replaced over time. The you that existed 10 years ago no longer physically exists, but you still feel like the same person because your memories and consciousness have remained continuous. In this view, the teleporter simply speeds up a process that is already happening slowly. The copy at the destination is still you because it continues the same pattern of memories, thoughts, and experiences. Others disagree. They argue that destroying the original body breaks the chain of continuity. The person who steps out of the teleporter might believe they are you, but they are not the same person who stepped into the machine. Instead, they are a copy, a new person who starts their life at the moment they step out. The original you has been destroyed. In this view, teleportation is less like transportation and more like death followed by cloning. To make the problem even more complex, imagine the teleporter malfunctions. Instead of destroying your original body, it creates a copy at the destination while leaving the original intact. Now there are two of you, one at the starting point and one at the destination. Both have the same memories and believe they are the real you. Which one is the true version of you? If your identity is tied to your physical body, perhaps the original is the real you, but if your identity is based on your memories and personality, then both versions are equally you. Even they are now two separate individuals. This scenario highlights the tension between two ideas about personal identity. One idea, called the body view, says that your identity is tied to your physical body. The other, called the psychological view, says that your identity depends on the continuity of your memories, thoughts, and consciousness. Parfit's teleport challenges both views by creating situations where the usual markers of identity, your body and your mind, no longer align in the way we expect. If we accept that the teleporter creates a perfect copy, we are forced to Confront some uncomfortable implications. If the copy is truly you, then what does it mean to say that you exist? Does your sense of self rely on something deeper than physical or psychological continuity, something that cannot be copied, or is the idea of a fixed, unchanging self an illusion? Parfit's experiment suggests that identity might not be as concrete as we like to believe. Instead, it might be a matter of perspective, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of our experiences. Some philosophers use this thought experiment to argue that personal identity is not what matters. They suggest that what really matters is the continuation of your experiences and memories, even if the physical or psychological continuity is interrupted. If the person who steps out of the teleporter feels like he remembers your life and behaves as you would, then for all practical purposes they are you. From this perspective, the destruction of the original body is not a significant problem, because the essence of you continues and the copy others are less comfortable with this conclusion. They point out that the teleporter raises ethical questions. If the original body is destroyed, is that equivalent to murder? Even if the person who steps out feels like you, does the destruction of the original violate your rights? And if both the original and the copy exist simultaneously, do they both have equal claims to your identity? These questions show how Parfit's teleporter blurs the boundaries of identity, forcing us to think about what it really means to be a person. Parfit's teleporter also has implications for technology and the future. If teleportation became a reality, how would society respond? Would people use teleporters without hesitation, trusting that their identity remains intact, or would the destruction of the original body create a sense of unease, making teleportation a controversial technology? The thought experiment also raises questions about cloning, brain uploading, and artificial intelligence. If a copy of your brain could be uploaded to a computer, would that copy still be you? These ideas might seem futuristic, but they challenge us to think about the limits of identity and consciousness. In the end, Parfit's teleporter is not about finding a definitive answer. It's about exploring the complexities of personal identity and the assumptions we make about ourselves. It invites us to question whether our sense of self is tied to something physical, psychological, or something else entirely. The experiment forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about continuity, consciousness, and what it means to exist while there may never be a clear resolution. The thought experiment reminds us that identity is not as simple as it seems. It challenges us to look beyond the surface and think deeply about who we are. The paradox of the burden of proof is a problem rooted in the idea of responsibility. During debates or discussions, when someone makes a claim, they are typically expected to provide evidence to support it. However, things get tricky when the person who hears the claim challenges it by asking for more and more proof. This can create a situation where no amount of evidence is ever enough. The original claimant might feel trapped in an endless loop of justifying their position while the other person continually shifts the goalposts. It's this dynamic that creates a paradox. If proving something requires constantly meeting impossible standards of evidence, can anything ever really be proven? To understand this paradox, consider a simple example. Imagine a friend tells you that they saw a UFO last night. This is a bold claim, so you ask them for evidence. They show you a blurry photo of a strange light in the sky. You respond by saying the photo could easily be something else, like a drone or an airplane. Your friend insists it was a UFO but offers no further proof. You tell them that without more solid evidence, like a physical object or multiple credible witnesses, you can't believe their story. Here the question becomes, how much proof is enough? Is it fair to dismiss their claim entirely because they can't meet your standards, or is there a point where their evidence, however limited, should at least be taken seriously? This issue frequently arises in scientific, philosophical, and even everyday discussions. In science, the burden of proof typically falls on those proposing a new theory. This makes sense because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims they've discovered a new particle, for example, they need to present experimental data that can be verified. Yet even in science, there's a threshold where skepticism can become unreasonable. If every piece of evidence is dismissed as insufficient, then no amount of proof could ever convince a determined skeptic. This is where the paradox emerges. While it's important to ask for evidence, it's also possible to use that demand as a way to avoid engaging with the claim altogether. Philosophy often explores this paradox through debates about existence. For example, if someone claims that God exists, they are often asked to provide proof. But if the person asking for proof dismisses every argument with "that's not good enough," then the discussion becomes unproductive. The same happens when someone claims that God doesn't exist. A believer can demand proof of that claim too, and the same cycle begins. Neither side can fully prove their position, yet both feel the other has failed to meet the burden of proof. This creates a stalemate, where the debate isn't about finding truth, but about who can demand more evidence from the other side. This paradox becomes even clearer when we consider negative claims. If someone says there are no unicorns, how could they prove it? It's impossible to search the entire universe to confirm the non-existence of something. The person making the positive claim, unicorns exist, has the easier job. All they need is one piece of solid evidence, a real unicorn. This is why in debates the burden of proof typically falls on those making positive claims. However, those making negative claims aren't entirely off the hook. If they assert something strongly, they still need to justify why they believe it to be true, even if they can't offer absolute proof. The paradox of the burden of proof is also prevalent in modern social and political discussions. For example, imagine a heated debate about climate change. One side argues that human activities are causing global warming, citing studies and data. The opposing side dismisses these studies as biased or incomplete and demands more proof. No matter how much evidence is presented, they continue to question its validity, effectively avoiding the need to present any counter-evidence of their own. This creates a frustrating dynamic where the burden of proof feels like a one-way street, with one side constantly defending their claim while the other side steps any responsibility to prove their counterarguments. In legal systems, the burden of proof plays a crucial role. In criminal cases, the prosecution must prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This protects individuals from being unjustly convicted based on weak or circumstantial evidence. However, this standard can sometimes lead to the paradoxical situation where obvious guilt cannot be legally proven. If a murderer leaves behind strong but circumstantial evidence and the defense creates just enough doubt, the prosecution may fail to meet its burden of proof. While this protects innocent people, it also means that some guilty individuals go free. This demonstrates how the burden of proof, while necessary, can sometimes work against justice. The paradox of the burden of proof often arises in online debates where people can make claims without much accountability. For instance, someone might say vaccines are harmful without offering any credible evidence. When challenged, they might insist that others disprove their claim rather than supporting it themselves. This is a classic example of shifting the burden of proof. The person making the claim avoids responsibility by turning the challenge onto their critics. This tactic can derail discussions and leave important topics unresolved. To navigate this paradox, it's important to approach claims with both skepticism and fairness. Skepticism ensures that we don't accept unsupported ideas, while fairness ensures that we don't demand impossible levels of proof. A reasonable approach is to ask for evidence that matches the strength of the claim. For example, extraordinary claims like the existence of UFOs or telepathy should be backed by extraordinary evidence. On the other hand, everyday claims like it rained yesterday don't require the same level of scrutiny. By calibrating our expectations, we can avoid falling into the trap of endless doubt. The paradox also teaches us to be mindful of our own biases. Sometimes we dismiss evidence not because it's insufficient, but because it challenges our beliefs. In such cases, demanding more proof becomes a way to protect our worldview rather than seeking truth. By recognizing this tendency, we can engage in discussions more openly and productively. It's also helpful to clarify the burden of proof at the start of any debate. Agreeing on who needs to provide evidence and what kind of evidence is acceptable can prevent misunderstandings and keep the discussion focused. Ultimately, the paradox of the burden of proof reminds us that knowledge is a shared responsibility. It's not enough to demand proof from others. We must also be willing to evaluate evidence honestly and provide justification for our own beliefs. While it's unlikely that every claim can be resolved to everyone's satisfaction, approaching the burden of proof with balance and integrity allows us to engage more thoughtfully with the world and with one another. Imagine a pill that could erase your bad memories. It wouldn't harm you physically, and it wouldn't alter your ability to function in day-to-day life. It would simply remove the memories of your most painful experiences, leaving you with a clean slate. You could let go of the moments that haunt you, the loss of a loved one, a betrayal, or deep personal failure. But here's the question: would taking that pill make you happier, or would it take away something essential to who you are? At first glance, the idea seems appealing. Painful memories can weigh us down, replaying in our minds and making us relive moments we'd rather forget. For someone struggling with the aftermath of a traumatic event, the pill might feel like a miracle. Imagine a person haunted by the memory of a serious car accident. They might find it hard to drive again, or even to sit in a car. The pill could take away the memory of the crash entirely, freeing them from the anxiety and fear that comes with it. Life could feel easier, simpler, and lighter. But then another question arises: if you erase the bad memories, what happens to the lessons you learned from them? Every painful experience teaches us something, even if the lesson isn't immediately clear. That same person who survived a car accident might have developed a deeper appreciation for life or stronger sense of resilience if they took the pill. They might lose the pain, but they could also lose the growth that came with it. Pain, for all its difficulty, shapes us. It forces us to adapt, to reflect, and to find meaning in our struggles. There's also the question of identity. Who are you without your memories? Our experiences, both good and bad, make up the story of our lives. They influence our decisions, our relationships, and even how we see ourselves. If you erase the difficult parts of that story, do you become someone new? Imagine a person who has spent years overcoming a tough breakup. That experience might have taught them what they value in a partner and what they want in a relationship. If they take the pill, they might forget the pain of the breakup, but they might also forget the clarity it brought. Would they lose part of themselves in the process? Another consideration is the long-term impact of erasing bad memories. If you forget the pain, does that mean you're more likely to make the same mistakes? Someone who erases the memory of a failed business venture might lose the lessons they learned about managing risk or making smarter decisions. Without those lessons, they might find themselves in similar situations, repeating patterns they no longer remember. Painful memories often serve as warnings, guiding us away from harmful choices. If those warnings disappear, do we lose the ability to grow and change? At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that some memories are so painful they seem unbearable. Trauma can leave deep scars that don't easily heal. For people who experience post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), certain memories can disrupt their lives entirely. Nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety can make even ordinary tasks feel impossible. In cases like these, the pill might feel like the only way to regain a sense of normalcy. It raises the question of whether the value of keeping painful memories always outweighs the harm they cause. Let's consider a different angle. What if someone only erased a single bad memory but kept the rest of their experiences intact? For example, imagine someone who regrets a single decision that led to the loss of a friendship. They feel guilt and sadness every time they think about it, but they've already learned the lesson it taught them. Would erasing just that memory improve their quality of life, or would they always sense that something important was missing even if they couldn't name it? The complexity of memory means that even removing a single moment could have ripple effects on other parts of a person's life. The science of memory complicates the dilemma even further. Memories aren't static. Every time we recall an event, our brains subtly alter it over time. Memories become less accurate and more influenced by emotions, biases, and even new experiences. In some cases, the emotional weight of a bad memory can grow heavier simply because we've replayed it so many times. If this is true, does erasing the memory solve the problem, or does it simply remove the chance to reinterpret and process it over time? There's also a moral dimension to the sleeping pill dilemma. If people had the ability to erase their bad memories, how would that change society? Would people take less responsibility for their actions, knowing they could simply forget the consequences? Would relationships become more fragile if people erased the pain of arguments or betrayals instead of working through them on a larger scale? Would entire communities choose to forget painful chapters of history rather than confront and learn from them? Memory isn't just personal, it's also collective. It shapes how we grow as individuals and as a society. The sleeping pill dilemma forces us to confront the nature of happiness. Is happiness the absence of pain, or is it something deeper? True happiness often comes from finding meaning even in difficult times. A person who has experienced loss might still find joy in the memories of their loved one or in the resilience they built through grief. If they erase the pain, would the joy remain? Happiness and pain are often intertwined, making it hard to separate one from the other. Ultimately, the sleeping pill dilemma is about choice. Some people might choose to take the pill, valuing the relief it offers over the lessons and identity tied to their pain. Others might choose to keep their memories, no matter how painful, seeing them as essential to their growth and understanding of life. Neither choice is inherently right or wrong. It depends on the person and the nature of their experiences. The dilemma doesn't have a clear answer, and perhaps that's the point. It invites us to reflect on what it means to be human. We are shaped by our memories, yet we are not defined by them. We carry our pain, but we also find ways to heal and move forward. The sleeping pill may not exist in real life, but the questions it raises are real. Would you erase your pain if you could, or would you choose to carry it knowing it's part of who you are? That's a question only you can answer. The decision-making loop is a concept that reveals how our minds can get trapped in endless cycles of choice and indecision. It's what happens when you feel overwhelmed by options and can't commit to a decision, either because you fear making the wrong choice or because you constantly second-guess yourself. This loop doesn't just make decision-making harder, it can paralyze you entirely, leaving you stuck in a frustrating cycle of overthinking. Imagine standing in front of a row of vending machines, each stocked with different snacks. You're hungry and have money, but there are so many options. You start weighing the pros and cons of each snack. One is healthier, another is tastier, one is cheaper, and another is bigger. You think about what you'll regret more, choosing the wrong snack or missing out on a better one. Before you know it, 10 minutes have passed and you still haven't pressed a button. This is a small example of the Decision-making loop at work. What should be a simple task turns into a mental tug-of-war. The loop often starts with uncertainty. When faced with a decision, you want to make the best choice possible. This desire for perfection can lead you to overanalyze every detail looking for the right answer. But many decisions don't have a single correct option. There are just different outcomes. Instead of accepting this, you might continue searching for the perfect solution, hoping to eliminate all doubt as you do this. New factors or concerns might pop up, leading you to revisit the decision again and again. The process feeds itself, and you get stuck in the loop. Let's take another example, choosing a career path. Imagine a young adult trying to decide between becoming a doctor or an artist. Being a doctor offers stability and respect, but it requires years of study and dedication. Being an artist provides creative freedom, but comes with financial uncertainty. Instead of committing to one path, the person keeps debating. They might start researching what other people did, asking for advice, or reading articles about the pros and cons of both career. Each new piece of information complicates the decision, pulling them further into the loop. Weeks or months later, they are no closer to making a choice, and the time spent debating feels wasted. This loop becomes more dangerous when the stakes are high or when time is limited. Imagine a soldier in combat who needs to decide whether to advance or retreat. Overthinking in this situation could cost lives. The same applies to firefighters, emergency room doctors, or anyone who works in high-press situations. They can't afford to get stuck in a decision-making loop because hesitation can have dire consequences. This is why professionals in these fields are trained to make quick, confident decisions based on the information they have in the moment. At its core, the decision-making loop is rooted in fear of failure, fear of regret, fear of the unknown. You might think, what if I make the wrong choice? What if something better is just around the corner? These thoughts can prevent you from committing to any decision at all, but ironically, not deciding is a decision in itself. By avoiding action, you're choosing to stay stuck, and this often leads to more frustration and anxiety than if you had simply made a choice and moved forward. One reason this loop is so hard to escape is that our brains crave certainty. We want to know we're making the right decision, but life rarely provides that kind of clarity. Most decisions involve trade-offs, and it's impossible to predict every outcome. For example, if you're deciding whether to move to a new city, you can research housing costs, job opportunities, and weather patterns, but you can't know exactly how it will feel to live there until you go. The desire for certainty can keep you trapped in a loop, constantly gathering more information, but never taking action. Sometimes the decision-making loop is fueled by the abundance of choices in modern life. Psychologists call this choice overload. When you have too many options, it becomes harder to compare them all. Imagine shopping online for a new phone. You compare brands, models, reviews, prices, and features. Each option has its strengths and weaknesses, and as you continue to browse, new options keep appearing. The sheer number of choices can feel overwhelming, making it harder to commit to any one phone. This is why people often feel more satisfied with their decisions when they have fewer options to choose from. Breaking out of the decision-making loop requires a shift in mindset. First, it's important to accept that no decision is perfect. Every choice involves some level of risk or uncertainty. Instead of aiming for perfection, focus on making the best decision you can with the information you have. Recognize that it's okay to make mistakes. They are part of learning and growing. If you choose something and it doesn't work out, you can adjust course later. Another strategy is to set clear criteria for your decision. If you're buying a car, for example, decide in advance what features matter most to you, maybe safety, fuel efficiency, and price. Then evaluate each option based on those criteria, and once you find one